I'm Dave Wilson. I'm a member of the People for Effective Government, or PEG. Again, thank you all for coming tonight. And a very heartfelt thank you to Whitworth University for allowing us to use this fabulous facility. Isn't it grand? Yeah. Can we give them a round of applause? This event is sponsored by the Weyerhaeuser Center, and I want to extend a special thanks to Dr. Dale Soden, a professor of history here at Whitworth. Dale would normally be here, but was significantly delayed in returning from Vietnam with 10 students on a Jan term trip. So he sends his regrets. And by the way, the PEG organization, we started doing public forums last April, and Dale was our inaugural speaker. So, and thanks to him and his support of our organization, he was the one that helped line up this facility. So let's give Dale a round of applause as well. I'd like to take a couple minutes just to put a plug in for PEG. PEG is a Spokane-based nonpartisan coalition. PEG's mission is to support bipartisan approaches to governing, which are fiscally responsible and ensure an adequate social safety net and promote a civil society. The members of PEG are committed to changing the current political climate in which our two major parties have become increasingly polarized. Case in point, what's going on right now. More specifically, we are committed to encouraging sincere and civil debate about the challenges that our nation faces and about effective solutions to those challenges. Developing compromise policy that finds reasonable balance between positions of the left and the right, thereby benefiting the majority of our citizens. If you are interested in learning more about PEG or becoming a member of PEG, please visit our website, which is pegnow.org. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker tonight, Shawn Vestal. The members of PEG have asked Shawn to speak tonight because we believe deeply in the freedom of the press. We believe that a free press helps keep us free and is essential to a thriving democracy. Shawn will give a 30 to 40-minute talk, and then he'll open it up to your questions. This evening's presentation and the question and answer period will be videotaped and will be available for viewing on YouTube through a link on our website, again, pegnow.org. Shawn Vestal grew up in rural southern Idaho. He's worked at the Spokesman Review since 1999 as an editor, as a reporter, and for the last several years as a columnist. He spent a decade prior to that working as a journalist at community newspapers in Idaho, Oregon, and Montana. Shawn is also an accomplished author. His debut album, you are a rock star, Shawn. His debut novel, Daredevil, was published in 2016 by Penguin Press. His collection of short stories, God-Forsaken Idaho, published by New Haven in 2013, was the winner of the Penn Robert Bingham Prize, which honors a debut book and that represents distinguished literary achievement and suggests great promise. He also published A.K.A. Charles Abbott, a short memoir, as a Kindle single in 2013. His stories have also appeared in numerous literary journals. Shawn earned his Master's of Fine Arts in fiction writing in 2008 from Eastern Washington University, and now teaches in that distinguished program. He lives in Spokane with his wife and son. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Shawn Vestal.
Thank you very much. This thing's just going to hang here. Now I want to have a debut album. I mean, I'd much rather have a debut album. This is kind of a cliche of mine at this point, but I always say that I became a writer to avoid talking to people. So just preface it with saying that this is not my first skill, and I have a variety of thoughts about what I see as a kind of a crisis of misinformation in the country right now. And I'll try to bring these together into a single point, but they may not necessarily cohere. I want to build this conversation around two stories. The first story is a personal story from my own life from about 30 years ago, or probably longer than that, and a more recent story from our national politics, and then somehow try to bring them together. So when I was a teenager, is this still on? Can you hear me? Is that good? Yeah. A man in our community, regional community, was arrested for abusing children, for sexually abusing children. My family knew this man. We knew his children. He and his wife were good friends of my parents. We were all members of the LDS church. We were all Mormons. And we had attended the same ward in our local church in Gooding, Idaho for many years. At the time of the arrest, this other family had moved to a neighboring town, and so we hadn't been in regular contact with him for a couple of years. Anyway, this man was arrested. He was charged with felonies for this conduct. And the daily newspaper in our area, the Times News of Twin Falls, Idaho, reported on this arrest with a brief item on the inside of the local news section. Probably 3 paragraphs long, maybe 4 paragraphs long. It was very straightforward, it's very simple. It was lacking in any kind of detail. I can remember reading that article in the paper. My brother and I were sitting at the breakfast bar in our home, and my mother was starting to work on dinner in the kitchen across the bar from us. And I can still picture my mom reading this item. We were like, "Mom, check this out." And she read the item, standing there. She threw the paper down in disgust and said, "Those people will do anything to hurt the Mormons." It's a real vivid moment in my life for a lot of reasons. I think about it now a lot because I'm in the business, and I think about the disconnect between people like my mother, very conservative, very religious people, and the press. And I'm concerned about the deepening of that. And I think about her certainty that it was wrong, and that it was wrong because of a conspiracy against her and people like her. And I remember that moment also because it was another marker along these diverging roads that my mother and I were on at the time. In lots of ways. I was growing up, getting ready to leave the house. I knew I'd be leaving the church. That was the most important thing in my mom's life. And that had been super important to her in so many ways, and therefore to my family, right? I don't hate the Mormon church, but I knew I wasn't going to be a Mormon. And I don't mean to disparage her religious beliefs when I say that her faith was built on more than just her religious beliefs. She had this faith that was made of a larger cultural sense, a series of unshakable beliefs in that she never questioned. She was faithfully devoted to. And they included the belief that the world at large, the outside world, so to speak, the institutions of society, the press, universities, scientists, police and prosecutors, although she might not have put it that way, journalism for sure, and city life were all arrayed against her and people like her, and were not to be trusted. We're fundamentally not to be trusted. She was closed off, I think, as a result of this, to certain access to the factual world. And part of it was because what she was already certain about. So even at that age, I saw that little article in the newspaper differently. I could see in the little 3 or 4 paragraphs, and I was not, by the way, interested in being a journalist at that point. I was going to be like Ernest Hemingway or something. And So I wasn't in any way defensive at the time as a journalist, which I am now to some degree, anyway. I could see in these little paragraphs that the arrest of this man had involved the police, and it also had involved a prosecuting attorney. And the case would proceed under the watch of a judge. And all of that existed outside the control of the newspaper. I could tell that already if you just read what was in the little story. It was a simple statement of facts. I could see nothing that suggested a bias or a smear. I could see nothing that would suggest any effort to attack this guy by writing this short, dry, dull little news brief and putting it on the inside of the local news section. I immediately was like, that can't be right that this is such a conspiracy. Because wouldn't a conspiracy be more harmful to him? Wouldn't it be, I don't know, better in terms of achieving what it was trying to achieve? And most importantly, one of the things that I think about when I remember that event is that I could see it would be almost impossible for us to ever reconcile our differences. It would be impossible for me to make the case to my mom about the media that she had already decided was one way and one way only, and that we probably would just have to not broach this particular gulf between us. At the time, I remember thinking this would be something I left behind when I went out into the world, her resistance toward facts and this rush to declare entire systems of people as lined up against me when they told me things that I didn't like. Now, the man that was in the newspaper that day, for whom my mom felt such defensiveness, he was guilty. He confessed and he went to prison, and his victims were his kids, who we also knew and loved. And look, I love my mom. I'm not trying to say anything too harsh about my mother here, but I have often wondered why the sympathy of not just her, but people in the community rushed toward the man and not toward the children. And he was protected in the ways that lots of people in in close-knit religious communities can be protected by people who already thought they knew what was true about him. So why am I bringing up my poor mother and talking about her in this way? You know, my poor mother, who I love, who's alive to this day, and whom I'm going to see in a few weeks, and with whom I won't talk about the press at all. Here's why I'm bringing it up. I want to discuss what I see as a crisis of truthfulness in American life. And this is an institutional problem that is shared certainly by the press. And by bringing it up, I don't want to say that journalism does not have manifold errors for which that bear responsibility for this break between certain members of the public and the media at large. But I also want to talk about something that's a little trickier to talk about, something that's a little more sensitive, and especially if you're a member of the media, something that seems like maybe you shouldn't talk about, and that is the level of individual responsibility that citizens have in a democracy to be good purveyors, or not good purveyors, good consumers of fact, to be kind of savvy and skeptical and open toward reading the world in a factual way, and being immune to bad information and lies and conspiratorial thinking, which makes all of us sick. It's like being immunized. We need enough people to have herd immunity against bad information, I think. And certainly the institutional parties bear responsibility, but I also believe that individuals do. Individuals like my mother, who I love. And I want to talk about it in a way that's not contemptuous. So that's why I'm talking about my mother. There's a long way to that explanation, I know it was. So I have some very serious disagreements with people who attack the mainstream media, obviously, and I don't mean that I don't think you can't criticize the mainstream media. I don't mean that I think you can't question it, challenge it. I think all of those things are absolutely important. They're as important as it is that there be a free press, is that the press be open to, susceptible to, and responsive to criticisms. But I have very serious disagreements with people who have wholesale wholesale judgments of the press in which the press are fake, the press are liars, the press are manipulating information, chiefly for political gain. And I think that kind of thing only succeeds in information vacuums. Bad information only thrives once good information has been shown the door. Which brings me to my second story. In 2012, a young man in Connecticut stole his mother's guns, walked into Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, and he killed 26 people. 16 of those people were 6 years old. 6-year-old kids. A man who runs a crackpot, conspiratorial, alternative media universe known as InfoWars began to do something then that is unfortunately all too common in the extremist fringes of certain kinds of zealotry, especially online zealotry right now. He began to say that it was a hoax. He's not the only person who does it. It's not uncommon to hear that, but he might be the most, he might have the largest audience of the people who does that, of the people who do that, I'm sorry. It isn't uncommon now for just about anything to be labeled a hoax. Not biased, not mistaken, not flawed, not problematic, but entirely invented by bad actors. InfoWars and the guy who runs it, a guy named Alex Jones, they have an unusually large platform within this world of disinformation, and that platform grew in stature in recent years, in part because it was given a lot of legitimacy when then candidate Donald Trump essentially endorsed it. President Trump, who does not let a day pass without saying a lot of things that are not true, while also saying that the media is fake, like some of these other folks. He went on Alex Jones's show in 2015 when he was a candidate, not president, if I didn't say that already. He answered Jones's questions, and he told Jones he had an amazing reputation, and he was going to try to do his best for him. At the time the president did this, Jones had been saying for 3 years, 2.5 years, repeatedly and confidently that the Sandy Hook shooting was fake. It was a false flag operation in the language of that world. He had said it had, quote, inside job written all over it. He called it, quote, synthetic, completely fake with actors, in my view. He claimed the whole thing was fake. It was staged, a giant hoax, and suggested that the people who went on TV and talked about their dead children were actors, that they were faking it, and you could tell. Here's a paragraph from a real news story about that from the New York Times. Sandy Hook families have been followed, videotaped, and harassed by people demanding proof that their loved ones actually died. Monuments to the slain children in Newtown have been stolen and defaced. And Alex Jones, devotee, went to prison last year after phoning and emailing Leonard Posner, the father of one of the boys who died, one of the 7-year-old boys who died, with death threats. The family had to relocate to a gated community with 24-hour security. This is not, unfortunately, a limited phenomenon. I get emails and social media messages anytime I write about guns from people passing along information from this website. And it almost always takes the framing of actors are hired to go and pretend there was a shooting, and they include things like the kids from the Parkland High School shooting. You'll get memes that show them supposedly being interviewed from TV shows from other shootings. These are lies. These are made-up, intentional lies. And they're sold by people who believe that the mainstream media lies constantly about them. And they're sold to people who believe that the mainstream media lies constantly about them. I'll just say that it can be dismaying to work in the information business and hear from people with such faith in such cruel, obvious nonsense. So between my two stories here, the one about my mother and whom I love, and the one about Alex Jones, who I think I loathe, I have had a long and lucky and interesting career as a journalist. It's one which I'm proud. And it's not because I'm proud of any particular thing that I've done, but it's a work that I'm proud of. It's an effort that I'm proud of. And it's work that I consider essential to a healthy democracy. I consider it of service to the public. It's work I believe at its best contributes to better governance and a better society. But it's also work that has to connect with citizens to really help the democracy. It can't just exist in a vacuum. I didn't set out to be a journalist. I attended the University of Idaho in the early 1980s as an English major. thinking I would become a writer and a teacher. After 3 years there, though, I needed to take a semester off and earn some money. I was putting myself through school back in the whatever age that was when you could put yourself through school, like without going into a lifetime's worth of debt. And that semester off that I was taking kind of grew. I was aimless. I was an aimless kid in lots of different ways, and less responsible than I should have been in lots of different ways. And before long, I wasn't taking a semester off. I had dropped out, kind of a slow motion dropout. And part of this dropping out had to do with starting to work in journalism. While working at a grocery store to earn money for college, I picked up a few assignments from my hometown weekly newspaper, the Gooding County Leader, which at that time hired me, and I didn't know what I was doing at all. I had no journalism training, but they just hired me to write a few pieces for them, including going to some city council meetings in Gooding and neighboring Wendell. And for the Gooding County Leader, the city council is like the White House. And so I was no good at it. I didn't know what I was doing, but I enjoyed it almost right away, which I think is weird because those meetings are not that enjoyable, I got to tell you. They talk about sewer projects and stuff, but I sort of liked it, and I felt right away that the people in town should have access to information about this. A lot of them probably don't really want access to information about it. They don't want to read about the sewer, but I just thought it would be important public work to gather that information and try to explain it in a way that's better than the way the people in that room were explaining it to each other, easier to understand but still accurate, and that would be work that had social value to do that kind of thing. I felt that right away, and when a full-time job opened up at our sister paper in Jerome, Idaho, I took that job. And that meant that I was earning the kind of money that you earn at weekly newspapers in Idaho in 1987 or 8, whenever that was, and so I was no longer saving money for college, definitely at that time. So at the first job, I was the only member of our editorial staff. I covered the school board and the city council and the county commission, and I covered high school football and lawsuits over haystack fires and every parade and elementary school award ceremony. I had no journalism education, but I tried to learn as I went. I tried to read. I worked very hard, and I enjoyed the work. I felt I was making a difference in the community, helping to provide information that people wanted to know and needed to know. And this is crucial for me, I interacted with people that I covered and with the people who read the paper on a regular basis and on an unpredictable basis, like walking around town at the grocery store. And it's true here as well, but it's much more true in Jerome, Idaho, that if you'll run into the mayor at the grocery store or anybody that you wrote about on the street with either a complaint or a story idea, that's good for you as a journalist, right? All of us should have to get in a room together with the people we just wrote about on a regular basis. And let me tell you, sometimes that is not comfortable, and sometimes I don't want to do it. But it is a part of being responsible, I think. And it's always what I think, it's always how I think about what I do as a member of the community, as someone who shares this place and is accountable for the work in a personal way. And that's true even now as I've crossed over into opinion writing. It's definitely not lost on me that I might run into the mayor or the sheriff or Representative Matt Shea, about whom I've had a lot of critical things to say and who I ran into at a sushi restaurant once. He didn't want to talk to me then either, but it was a reminder that I'm not away from the people that I write about. And especially when I write critical things about people, it's an important reminder that I'm not away from them. I'm going to run into them at some point and have to look them in the face. And I better feel like I did the right thing if I do that. I wandered off on a little bit of a tangent here. So anyway, in those early days, I was also ambitious. I wanted to move to greener pastures, larger papers, bigger paychecks. So over the next several years, I worked at small daily newspapers around the West, in Burley, Idaho, and Coeur d'Alene, Bozeman, Montana, and Roseburg, Oregon. And I came to the Spokesman in 1999, at the very tail end of it, right before Y2K, as an editor overseeing teams of reporters. I was the youngest reporter, the youngest editor on a large staff at the time. I mean, the size of the Spokesman staff then was crazy compared to what it is now. But they had a Y2K editor, and the youngest editor drew that straw. So I came into the newsroom and I was the Y2K editor for 5 weeks, I think. Remember the thing that was supposed to bring down all our computer systems? Well, it didn't happen, so it wasn't a great job. I was our Idaho editor for a time and our politics editor, and I oversaw teams that covered poverty and social services, and it's kind of a middle manager job, like close to the reporting, dealing directly with the reporters. In all of that time, I didn't feel much different than that young guy in Jerome, Idaho. I felt and I still feel that it's important to cover the activities of local government, the kind of coverage that isn't always popular or sexy, but in my view is the main reason we exist. I felt and I still feel that it is important to be aggressive on behalf of citizens and to push those in authority to be accountable. I felt and still feel that it is important to write about the people in the community, to highlight those who are doing good work and interesting things, and not just writing about gloom and doom all the time, although I'm occasionally accused of that, and I might not have too good of a defense. But I do definitely still carry within me the guy who would have to go out and write about somebody who had a weird-looking potato. A potato that looked like Richard Nixon. Well, I'm over there with my camera, you know? So I worked with hundreds of journalists over those years, of all kinds of styles and abilities, with journalists who went on to work at some of the most heralded papers in the country, winning awards and doing big-time projects, and with journalists who still live in their communities, covering their local governments, doing the public service journalism at small papers. And though newspapers are in a time of great danger, and the survival of their particular form of journalism is by no means certain, I don't think, the work continues in serious and important ways, and I think those ways are crucial to our society. And I think that's true at the national level. I think it's true at the local level. And just a quick tangent, I think it's maybe a bigger problem at the local level. I think large national news organizations are going to find a way to monetize their large bases and survive. The New York Times is going to be fine. Spokesman, we're going to, muddle along. When I go home, the Gooding County Leader is no longer there. It doesn't exist at all. There's a little flyer, a little shopper that covers the area that 4 local weeklies used to cover. I think that's playing out all over the country. One constant of this journalism career that I've had has been that I've always been here in the West and always been somewhat near to places where the groups that engage in the most kind of extremist conspiratorial activity have occasionally made their way into the news, whether that's, See, so when you're a writer and you've mixed up the pages of your speech, well, when I was about to, oh, that is perfect. My wife is going to laugh about this. So I always lived near populations that were conservative. Like I grew up among Republicans. I've lived in places all my life. Spokane is like the San Francisco of my life, even though my own politics are to the left for sure. But I always lived in these western towns, and so I was always interested in the relationship between what I see as mainstream conservatism, like what my brother, the Mormon bishop who's a banker, might believe in. He's a Mitt Romney kind of guy. I consider him very reasonable. He's as distressed by the current moment as I am. And the relationship with that and the more conspiratorial or the worst kind of extremist fringes. I grew up around John Birchers and other folks with radical beliefs. And I also grew up around a lot of moderate, common sense, public-minded conservatives, people that are in my family, people I love and know, all my friends, most of them from where I grew up. And all across the West, as I went from paper to paper, I paid a lot of attention to what I saw as the relationships between these two sort of parts of the political spectrum. because I was always near centers of extremism, whether it was the Freemen and the sovereign citizens in Montana when I worked in Montana, and the Freemen were having standoffs with federal agents. But then on some other level, they were just sovereign citizens in little towns who declared themselves basically nations unto themselves and would refuse to pay their taxes, or they'd show up and pay tax liens with bags of pennies as protests. And this stuff was always going on. And when I was in Idaho, I was around apocalyptic Christians and neo-Nazis. And here in Spokane, we've got a history of that as well. You know, we had Kevin Harpham tried to bomb our Martin Luther King Day parade. You know, I guess that's been 8 years ago now. But I have never, ever seen a time like now. I've never seen a time when people at the very top of our government continually attack the press as liars. Not complaining about the press, which I feel like everybody should probably complain about the press, but dismissing the press as liars, fakers, and elevating actual liars like Jones as amazing. I've never seen a time when the press is called repeatedly the enemy of the people. Never seen a time when the president just lies and lies and lies without a seeming care in the world for the truth. A depressing number of people either believe him or don't care whether he lies, so long as they can achieve their political goals. It is impossible in this kind of environment, I think, for the press to honor balance over truth. It is impossible to treat falsehoods as co-equal to facts, as the other side. I think this has been an era of a lot of great newspaper journalism. I do. And I would single out the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal, all of which I think are doing wonderful work. Not work that hasn't had mistakes and flaws, but work that if you consume it on a daily basis, in the big picture, has been invigorated to some degree by the current situation. But what I'm concerned about now, and what brings my two stories together maybe a little bit, I hope, is that the current situation might break the relationship between the public and the press more than it is currently broken. We've never seen such a fact-checking energy, such a calling out of the president among the press. Never seen such a vigorous effort to identify lies and falsehoods immediately as they're said. We've never seen a time when so much of the press afforded the president of the country so little an assumption of good faith. I think that's for good reason, and I think the press has to do what it's doing. But I think that to continually call out, to continually correct, you've put yourself in a position of certainty. And the position of certainty is not the best place to be if you are trying to be a seeker of the truth. My mother is really certain about whether or not that guy was guilty, right? I'm sometimes really certain about what I think about this or that political thing. And it turns out I'm wrong. And sometimes I could have seen that I was wrong if I had been a little bit less certain. And I think overall, if the press's function becomes continually saying, no, that's not right, this is right, if it's continually doing this correcting, and again, I think it has to do it. I'm not arguing that it shouldn't do it. But I believe this becomes this sort of death spiral because it's confirming the people who are already dubious about the press. I think the press only goes after the president. And if the president always has to be fact-checked, in my opinion, that is what the press is doing. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and I fear is going to damage the relationship between the public and the press even more. Too much certainty and not enough humility about the unknowable, that's a problem. That's a problem for journalists, it's a problem for anybody. Too much certainty tamps down your curiosity. It's bad for journalists, and I think it's going to exacerbate the distance between people who maybe aren't devotees of Alex Jones, but who are people like my mother, who are not that far, but who have already a deep distrust of the press, or people like my brother, who is not a fan of the current president, and again, not a fan of the current president, but who has grown up believing that the press is kind of against him, always kind of against him. Now, he's a more open-minded person. He takes in information from the media, but he believes that, and he's skeptical about it, and I wonder what this environment does to him what it makes him think about his relationship to the press. Well, when I found the other page, then I didn't go ahead and... This is sort of basic stuff, right? Get the pages in order. Anyhow, it's a Gordian knot. I don't know how to cut it. I don't come here with any brilliant ideas for what we can do to get around it. I think everybody has to continue to try to do what they think is right. I'm going to close with a couple of anecdotes, one of which I think illustrates a little ray of hope, and one of which illustrates not a little ray of hope. Not long ago, the president and members of his administration, while arguing in favor of building a wall, began to assert that a significant number of terrorists were coming through the southern border. And they started saying 4,000 known or suspected terrorists. Well, that's an accurate number if you include all ports of entry in the country. Actually, not just ports of entry, all places, anywhere trying to come into the country, 4,000. But none of them, at the time of that statistic, were believed to have come through the southern border. 0. A couple weeks after this, by the way, I saw an account where the State Department said it was 6. So it went from 0 to 6 in that period. I'm not 100% sure what happened, but it wasn't 4,000. So Sarah Sanders was on Fox News. Chris Wallace was the Fox News interviewer that night, and he stopped her and fact-checked her. Probably a lot of you saw that on social media. And she reacted in the way that a person who is engaged in a good faith interaction with someone to whom good faith has been granted and whom they treat the interrogator with good faith would normally respond, which is she didn't just insist it was correct. She was like, oh, okay, and she had to acknowledge that it was wrong, and the administration dropped saying that. And the reason that happened is because they were all in the same family. They trusted each other and they believed in each other in a way that in an ideal world, maybe we all would do. Like we'd all be able to do that across political aisles. We don't do that right now, but it gave me a little hope, a tiny little bit of hope, and it made me proud, honestly, of Chris Wallace for going against the stereotype of his station and doing the journalistic thing. The other anecdote I would share is that I read a story in the New York Times today about the latest survey on climate change and what people believe about climate change. And they did something significant to me that I think is the right thing to do, but I also think contributes to a gap between people in the country. And that is they used the word understand in their lead sentence. They said, this is the percentage of people who understand what's happening with climate change, not who believe in climate change. Now, that's a pretty significant shift, and it puts the people who don't understand it, right, in a position at odds with the New York Times. And I don't have any great answer for the way that you resolve these kinds of differences, but I do think that it's both the right thing to do and a kind of thing that'll contribute to further divisions among us. When you begin to identify this is right and that is wrong. Those of us who are columnists, we do that kind of thing all the time, but in the news coverage, the idea of even-handedness is an important principle, and I think in a lot of ways it's a good principle. I'm not arguing for doing away with it, but I think you can't equally balance things that are not unequal. But once you start to do it, I think there's a consequence. So I don't know that those things sort of add up into any kind of a thesis or a theme, but those are some of the things that I've been worrying about, fretting about, as I thought about what I might say tonight about our information world and what I think is important about it, my concerns about it. And I would just say that despite all the things that I've said about my mom, I'm going to go see her pretty soon. I guess I already said this part. And we're going to we'll have fun, we'll go eat, she'll help me on the piano, but we won't talk about the media. That's how we manage that, is we just pretend we don't, and we won't talk about politics either. I might say something that you might complain about it, but that'll be the end of it. So anyway, thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any questions. Thanks.
bring you the microphone so we can hear your question. Oh, that's fine.
How are the journalism schools handling that issue, and do you have some hope there?
Well, I have to say I don't know very much about how they're handling it. I occasionally go down to Washington State where I have friends who teach, and I'll visit a class and stuff. A lot of what the journalism classes are doing that I see in my interactions have to do with learning how to deal with the technologies. They're not about the political moment very much. Now I'm sure it's coming up, and I'm sure they're talking about it, but I'm not a regular. I did for a couple of years. I taught here at Whitworth. Actually, it's nice to be back up here, but I taught a class of freshmen who mostly were just trying to get out of comp by taking a journalism class. Like none of them wanted to be journalists, and I was like, okay, well I'm going to teach you anyway. So, but I don't know. And I sometimes when I meet with young people, I feel bad because I can't see into the tunnel ahead of us. Like I'm so steeped in the world I grew up in and the kind of journalism that I learned and value. And I don't want to be only dark about the future, but I sometimes fear when I'm talking to young people, like, I don't know what the world is like for you, employment-wise, as a journalist, I think the work is important. I think we need journalism, but I think newspapers are a uniquely lucrative, have been a uniquely lucrative way of supporting journalism, and that way is going away, and there is nothing that's replacing it. There's nothing that's going to return to the day where every business in town had to buy a newspaper ad, or if they wanted to buy an ad, that was the only place. I mean, newspaper companies, I sometimes joke, and I don't want to, I'm not commenting on the business acumen of my publisher, but I feel like business people, it must have been the easiest business in the world to make money in for the longest time. Like, especially as there was no fewer competitive newspaper towns, but I don't know what's going to replace it. That can pay people to do the work. So, I don't know if I answered your question, sorry. That gentleman.
Okay. I did get my degree in journalism a long time ago, and what we were learning then, as you're aware of, is Edward R. Murrow and other journalists that made a name for themselves. And it was all about getting two sides of the story and staying objective. Every test, every assignment, everything was about being right down the middle and getting both sides of the story. And the change I've seen in especially the last 5 and 10 years, is so enormous that it doesn't even resemble what I'm sorry.
Huh. That's all right.
It doesn't even resemble what I studied in college in the late 70s. So.
Do you mean all sorts of journalism, or the political journalism about Washington, D.C. now, or?
I mean the presentation of the news being so, it seems to be advocating for one side or the other, or interpreting. It actually went from reporting straight news to interpreting the straight news, now to opinions about the news.
Yeah.
So and we never would even thought about it in the late 70s.
Well, but in the late 70s, there would have been columnists, right? I mean, opinion journalism was a part of journalism.
But that was very separate, with huge walls all over it,
Yeah.
the editorial page and the news pages.
Yeah.
So.
Well, right. I mean, I grew up with that as a standard, and I do think neutrality in the reporting of news, not the stuff I do right now, but I think neutrality is an important value. I think objectivity is, I've never thought that was the right word. I know a lot of people use it because it's like everybody has opinions. But by the same token, everybody can control their opinions in doing professional work, or you should be able to if you're a journalist. Lawyers do it. They write neutrally when they write briefs and arguments for, journalists aren't the only ones who are expected to do it. Anyway, I don't disagree with you that analysis and opinion and is more a part of regular news. I don't see it as necessarily a bad thing. Like I think straight up two sides reporting of the Trump administration would be disastrously bad journalism. I think it would be. And so, anyway, that's my opinion, not my objective presentation of the facts, but anyhow, yeah.
We've got a few questions here. I'll start with Nancy. Mark Hogan.
Yeah. Well, I'm really happy to hear you, Shawn, because I love the things that you write in the paper. They seem so fair, and I really appreciate that. And I have written letters to the editor. I'm Nancy Street, in case you
Okay. Yeah.
know, we've had some back and forth on emails.
Yes.
But I just wonder, how free are you to write what you want to write for the paper? Do you have any control? Anybody that's saying, no, you can't write this? Or
No, I'm sorry.
you know, spokesman is known for being conservative and supporting the Republicans.
Well, I would say this, that I hear from a lot of Republicans who say their spokesman is known for being liberal. I'm sometimes called the head socialist at the Socialist Review. That's more than one time I've been called that. Anyway, I'm not arguing with you. I think over the years that I've worked there, there's been different editors, there've been different people covering things, and the editorial board has been conservative, but I think the paper itself has tried to be, to do good, responsible journalism, and I feel like that's, I feel like the people I've worked with in that room have done that. I don't think any of them have been bad actors in terms of trying to carry out some ideological mission for the publisher or the owners. I have never been told not to do something. That wasn't, there was a time or two that a line, like I'm not supposed to endorse, we have all these standards about who, like the editorial page endorses candidates, but I clearly make arguments for things that in politics that are involved with electoral choices that people make. And so sometimes the editors have felt like I was tiptoeing closer to saying, vote for Bob or don't vote for this initiative, when I'm supposed to just make the argument without saying those words. And I appreciate that distinction. I don't mind staying back from it too. But I've only ever been contacted by the publisher one time over a column that I wrote, and it was after something. And he has never said a word to me about write this or don't write that, not a time. And the only thing my editors have ever told me is if they think something might make a good column. Now, I sometimes go to them and I say, I want you to tell me, because the problem with a column is you start to repeat yourself, you know? And I've been editors of columnists. And it's hard to get your editors to tell you the truth about, you're just, not don't say this thing because it's too incendiary, but you're just saying the same thing you've said before. And I'm susceptible to it. Everybody who does the work I do is susceptible to it. And I seek that kind of feedback out from them. But nobody's ever said, no, you can't do this. And I know there are times, many times, that what I've filed has made the people in the offices have some heartburn. And nobody has ever said a word to me. So the guy who owns that paper does not agree with me. And he has never tried to interfere with what I do. So I appreciate that. Yeah.
Mark?
Hey, Shawn.
Hi.
I'd like your opinion on a couple of different issues. So one being the 24-hour news cycle, that it seems like it is a voracious consumer of opinion. So they have to have all these talking heads on, some people with expertise in whatever they're talking about, but a lot of them are journalists and not columnists or opinion people. I think straight up journalists are on these opinion shows or on these news shows, and they might be talking about what they're writing on, but they're often sharing their opinion. So I'd like your thoughts on that. And then I follow you on Twitter, and you're very entertaining, interesting. But I follow a lot of other people that I would consider journalists who oftentimes are sharing their opinion on whatever topic. So what do you think about the state of those two things?
Well, if you're a reporter and you go on TV and you express opinions about what you're reporting, I don't think you should do that. And I know what you're talking about. I don't watch a ton of cable news, and I think a lot of times when people talk about the media, they really are primarily talking about cable news. And so sometimes I'm not as, but I'll put on the TV if I'm making dinner, and I'll see Maggie Haberman on there from the New York Times. Now, I think Maggie doesn't usually cross the line, but I have seen her step back from something that she said. And I have seen her do it, and I've seen others do it on Twitter as well. And I think it's a danger when you're talking about your work. Our appetite for those shows, it doesn't seem to me like it always used to be that way. Like panels of people talking and arguing 4 hours a day on the same subjects. And I can get drawn into those, and I think they appeal to my worst instincts as a political person, not as a journalist, but as someone who's tried to listen to myself in ways that I didn't try to used to listen to myself in, and Twitter is 500,000 times worse. And I've argued with people on Twitter in ways that I would never argue with them in person. And sometimes I feel like, I feel strongly about it, and I'm really against what that is. And other times I think I just shouldn't have done that. And that's a different question than whether opinion writers or whether news writers are expressing their opinion. Anyway, I don't think it's an appropriate thing to do, but I also don't see it as a necessarily widespread problem. Perhaps I'm wrong about that. Maybe if I watched more, I think if people are dealing, you mentioned Murrow. Murrow abandoned the objectivity principle at some point and began to speak, as Cronkite did with the Vietnam War, from more of an opinion place. And I don't know where you exactly draw that line, but I don't deplore that kind of action if people are behaving responsibly. I don't think you could always do it. I don't think journalism could survive only on opinion. That would be terrible. But some reflection of the fact that you're a person with experiences who's spent some time thinking and maybe drawn some conclusions, I don't know. Some part of that, I think, is an honest response to being a witness and storyteller. I don't know how that fits in. I don't know how that becomes a large principle that we could apply to the business. But anyway, I sometimes am not sure where I come down on that. Because I do believe fundamentally that the most important thing the press does is the main job, the main neutral reporting is more important than what I do, what people on TV do. But what I do and what people on TV do gets more attention than the main neutral reporting. So anyway, it's a little bit of an insidious incentive system. Sorry.
I'll get to you next.
Shawn, I have a question. I'm going to challenge a supposition that I think I hear in your speech, and that is the supposition that there was a time when people relied upon the objectivity of the news, particularly the three major networks, the Associated Press, New York Times, Washington Post, and so forth. And people don't like the conflict that's going on now. But I'm going to ask you, what's wrong with a model in which there are vigorous institutions like Fox News on the one hand and the New York Times on the other hand, which are looking at the news from different perspectives and which are coming up with different storylines on the news because of their perspectives? You know, that really, in a marketplace of ideas where you have competing ideas, what's wrong with that model?
Well, maybe nothing's wrong with it. You know, I might be operating out of the set of assumptions that I grew up in and believe. I agree with you that there was not a time when everybody had great faith in the media. I don't agree that Fox News and the New York Times are two sides of the same coin, though. I think there are substantial journalistic reasons to trust the New York Times more than Fox News. And I might just be feeding my ideological priors by saying that. I recognize that. But I continually see things re-reported on Fox News, mostly on their opinion shows, that, in my view, are not even just wrong, that are outrageously, irresponsibly wrong. I mean, many of the things that have been peddled to a great degree on Fox News with regard to Robert Mueller. And Mueller might not find anything. I'm not saying I totally think Mueller's the God or something. But there's a movement afoot that lives in the White House and that is aided and abetted by Fox News. That is, it's not an alternative version of the same set of facts. It's a different worldview. Not worldview. There's nothing. There's obviously different worldview, but it's a different approach to, I think, the responsibility of handling the facts. And it is, I think it's feverishly conspiratorial. Now, I don't think that about the Wall Street Journal. I don't think it about any number of writers who are conservative, who I admire a lot. They tend to be maybe mainstream conservatives, as opposed to farther, more conservative conservatives, you know. But I think we need to try to find solutions to problems out of the same set of facts. And I think if we don't do that, then we can't come together, we can't agree on anything. And it might be kind of a fantasy that we would all sit around a table, metaphorically, and look at the same set of facts and share them and move on. But I think if we're all only in our own echo chambers, and if that's what the New York Times is for me, I acknowledge that might be true. It's hard to communicate with each other. It's hard to even know how to talk about what's happening at the border if I read the New York Times and my brother-in-law watches Fox News. We're not talking about the same world, right? Like there's no fact that we can agree on between us, and I think that's the danger. And maybe Fox isn't the best comparison. Maybe there's a conservative, and I do believe it would be possible to have, but I don't believe the New York Times is anywhere remotely near the partisanship of Fox. I know that people disagree with that.
Shawn, like Janny down there, I went to journalism school also back in the last century.
We all did.
Yeah. At the height of the Woodward and Bernstein era and the revelations about the Watergate. And I have to disagree, I guess, a little bit with Janny in terms of what we were taught. I was never taught to go right down the middle and be objective and provide balance on either side. What was hammered into me was who, what, when, where, why, and how are the facts. Get those right, and then provide context. And if that context includes any sort of emotional content in one direction or another on a story, make sure you attribute that to whoever you get that information from. And that was considered doing your job as a journalist. getting the basic facts and giving decent context. So I think, to me, context was what was hammered into me as being more important than balance. And I think of an example that we had in the news just yesterday, or from this weekend, the demonstration in Washington, D.C.,
Yeah.
where the video footage from the cell phone initially wasn't up close between the teenager and the Native American veteran. And then we see, like, 6 hours later, there's another wider shot. It's not just teenagers and the veterans. There's a third group involved. And then we learn sort of this revelation in context that this was a much larger demonstration. They were waiting for a bus. All that context, if it was really good journalism, would have been provided in the first story. And instead, it sort of sets off this, because they didn't do their job as a journalist in providing that context in the first story, it sets off this sort of contest flames from either side of the aisle, from the Fox News side versus the MSNBC side. So I think that there's a distinction there between providing balance and providing context.
Yeah.
The other thing is, I actually do have a question. I heard today, maybe I'm out of touch, but I heard today that the editorial board at the Spokesman Review no longer exists. Is that true?
Yep, that's been true for, anyway. The Inlander wrote a piece about it. We should have written a piece about it, if you ask me. But the Inlander wrote a piece about it around the time of the endorsements or something. But yeah, the editorial board shrank and shrank and shrank, and then for a while it was Gary Crooks and Stacy, and now Gary is no longer there. And so I don't even exactly know how they get I think they farm out the writing, but it's the publisher's point of view. I guess, I mean, it's disappointing for me too. I mean, I was talking about a race, and I'm not going to, I was talking about Dave's race today in the newsroom, and how his opponent was endorsed. And typically the Republican will get the endorsement of our board. That's been the history of that board. But when it had people on it, you would see exceptions, and those exceptions were based on people who came in and made the case that could override whatever the sort of natural resting point was. And in my view, that endorsement's a case where an interview would have made a difference, perhaps. An interview with a broader group of people, testing the candidates' bona fides and knowledge about issues, and judging them on more than just sort of surface stuff. But I would also say that it's always been the case that the publisher is the 51% vote on the editorial board, and so I'm disappointed in it. But the business is shrinking just radically. I mean, the number of things that we don't do that we used to do is great. We're less than half the size. When I came here, there was no room for anybody to sit in that room, and we had people cover it. We had so many people who covered schools that there had to be like 3 editors of the people who covered the school systems out from. And now I think we have one person who covers schools in addition to some other large beat. Like, you can't cover anyway. So I am disappointed in it, and it's one of a number of disappointments I have about the shrinking paper. So.
Thank you, Shawn, for being here again tonight. All right, I guess 2 things. I have a college roommate, and he and I used to get together for lunch for years and years and years, and finally we just fell apart because I would say one thing that maybe I would get from a source like yourself. He would say something that he would get from Rush Limbaugh, and we couldn't find, by the time the meal was over, something that we could kind of agree upon that gave us a basis, and he's of a good heart, to be able to go forward. And after a while, it just got old. So from that, for a long time now, I've really wanted to have some organization somewhere where there were some smarty pants liberals and some smarty pants Republicans and smarty pants libertarians and smarty pants socialists, and they could at least get together and say, you know what? To the best we can tell, this many people are coming across the southern border. And this is how we know that. And we all can agree that this is something that we could all try to work from there. And maybe one side or the other says, you know, I really have a hard time with that, but at least I could look at the arguments. I tried a while back to just go online and figure out, because I saw my friends sent me emails saying, hey, look what's going on. And there are so many websites, all looking very, very professional, all of them looking like they have some sort of real knowledge, and they were all over the place. How could little old me find the time between doing my day job to figure out on one issue, let alone all these? And then just a ray of sunshine or hope in this. The story that Jim brought up a moment ago. I love NPR, and they're now kind of eating a little bit of their own words as more and more is coming out about those videotapes and the altercation in D.C. And today, they mentioned that apparently a website, a Twitter account, or one of those, there's so many different types, they're now taken down because they were altering and they were using this to create division, kind of like the Rushkis have been doing recently.
I think they were amping it up. I don't think they
amping it
manipulated
up. They were
the
trying
tape.
to do that. Maybe that gives us a bad guy, the Rushkies, that we can use to say, if we're going to be Americans, if we're going to be patriots, if we're going to try to keep a country going that people fought for all these years, we need to agree that we're not going to do that. We need to have something in common so that we could come and vote and have different sides of view and then honestly work it out. But if we don't, and if we just go down to this side or that side, I'm afraid it's going to break up like my friendship with a friend from college.
Yeah.
Anyway, if you can make comments.
Well, I have a lot. I spent a lot of time thinking about and reading and watching the videos from those events and reading the analyses of them, and in some cases arguing with people about them. And with respect, I think a lot of people see a lot of things differently. And with respect to both of you, having done that, having watched the first video and found what I saw on the faces of those kids, very infuriating. And then having seen all of what's supposed to be expanding and exonerating their activities. And I'm telling you, I watched most of the hour and 20-minute video that the first walkbacks were based on. I read the Reason magazine articles that were shared widely as supposedly disproving the media narrative. I feel about the same about what those kids did as I did at the start. I tried to honestly, I have tried to not be someone who's resistant to saying I was wrong, but of course I'm resistant to saying I was wrong, right? I am, and we all are. So on Sunday, the day after the first day, I tried to make myself be open to it. And this is not what you asked me about, but I feel like the idea that people's initial reaction to that was totally been proven wrong by subsequent videos, that's a narrative that to me doesn't fit watching the actual videos. And I think that certain things happened, like everybody who said the first video was wrong said the Native American drummer was the aggressor. Well, everybody didn't say it, but a lot of people said he was the aggressor. Well, he walked up to them, and in his first interview that I read, he said he walked up to them. That's often cast as something the media said wrong on the first day. But the first words I read that he said in a print interview, I didn't watch all the TV, he said he went over there to get in between them. When he did that, on the video that supposedly exonerates the kids, what you see is a bunch of people, one kid standing in front of him humping like he's at a dance or something, kind of going like this. Everybody else doing whoa, 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 in time with the beating. You hear this on the video that supposedly exonerates the kids. You see them all doing this. That's what they did when he walked over to them. Now, it's a more complicated story than it was first reported, but I don't think it's that much more complicated, is my feeling.
I listened to it on the radio, so I didn't see it, and that's maybe part of the problem. Medium is the message in this case.
I think people might have social media, I think a lot of people had a lot to say about those kids, but that's true anytime there's an incident like that. I have had some resistance to the idea that this was, and I think it was seized upon in a politically opportunistic way, the way things often are. I don't know, there's a lot to it, and I'm not saying that people didn't say things about those kids that were over the top. I'll say this, if you could pardon my language for a minute. I referred to them as little shits on Twitter on the first day, and so that's part of why I was like, uh-oh. I mean, I didn't write about it or anything, but I was like, I think a lot of us see something in that kid's face. Maybe it's not there, but I think a lot of us see something that's familiar to us in that kid's face that doesn't look like a kid who's praying. Doesn't look like a kid who's praying to me. And that's what we're supposed to believe now in the revised story, is he was praying. Having gone through all of that, I would come back to that same judgment. And look, I have an 11-year-old, and sometimes I think he's acting like a little shit, I mean, by saying that, I was a teenage boy, and I think we're at our worst when we're teenagers. I was, and so, but that isn't what you asked me about. I've obviously obsessed about that, like a lot of us have, and wondered whether I got it wrong, and have perhaps said all of that as a way of defending myself for calling them little shits. But I don't know, and that's what I worry about. How do I participate in the reaching out and not getting angry myself, right? I'm not doing a good job of that at all in the last 2 years, at all. I've lost my mind is how I feel. And I feel like a lot of other people have as well. And I'm continually saying I'm going to be my better self politically. And I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. And the reason is I feel like there's an urgency to the situation that that is real and actual. And it's not. And I hope what we have is a momentary situation here, not the way our government is going to work for the rest of our lives, the way our society is going to work. But part of the reason that maybe I reacted negatively to the idea of different kind of media worlds, like in Britain, like all different kinds of papers and stuff like that. Maybe that's not a bad. I mean, we have it anyway, so maybe that's okay. But part of that is, I think we get hardened into our own corners, and I don't say that to judge other people. I say I am getting hardened into my own corners, and what I've done with the people, the very many people that I love, who I disagree with a lot about the current president, we just don't talk about it. My sister and I are trying to make amends after having some unproductive family conversations, let's say. So.
Two more questions, and they're both over here. So, okay. Hi, thanks for coming. Anyway, with regard to the border crisis, I look at the spokesman every day. I watch TV, and on the conservative side, a good case is made for building a wall. On the liberal side, I don't hear solutions. I hear all the things we shouldn't do. We shouldn't build a wall. Okay, what do we do instead? What are practical solutions to solve the border crisis? I hear some good arguments on the conservative side, but I don't hear any solutions. I just hear, I'm all for border security, but no, a wall is unnecessary, it's expensive,
and it's antiquated thinking, and okay, so what do we do to solve the border crisis? I don't see the solutions coming from the other side.
Well, I don't cover that myself, and I don't deal with I would say I think a lot of what you hear from people on the left is, I think, framing it as a border crisis, and that's maybe what we were talking about. Like, in a lot of ways, this is less of a crisis than we've had down there at any time in the last couple of decades. The crossings are down, the arrests, the apprehensions, and the idea that there's an urgent crisis. I'm not saying that we don't have we got a lot of problems with the immigration system, right? But the idea that there's a crisis that has to be dealt with a flood of people coming over the southern border, it's hard to build policy around disagreements over that. And I think that if you just look at the Border Patrol's numbers, if you look at the apprehensions, if you look at, there's all this evidence that, the caravan gets beaten as kind of a anecdotal drum, I think. And it's not a problem, but it's also not a flood of people coming over, including terrorists, and it gets characterized that way. And then if you're to say, well, what are the Democrats going to do to solve the crisis? I think a lot of them are saying they would argue whether it's a crisis. But that being said, they are also proposing things, and I don't know the details of them, but they include other kinds of monitoring. They include trying to work on people overstaying visas, which is, I think, the single largest or one of the single largest reasons that people who are undocumented in this country, they're not people who sneak across the border, they're people who come here on visas and then they expire. I think we have a system there now that cannot handle the people who come. I think if we could handle asylum, I think if we had resources for asylum, we would see, we wouldn't be seeing camps of people waiting for asylum or arguing about catch and release. I don't know, but frankly, I shouldn't have even started down that road because I don't know that much about it, other than having read some of the numbers and having seen people put forth some of the numbers on border crossings, and whether they think that's a crisis. So, but you know what? Opposition. This is a problem with our politics: is opposition in all things, right? Like opposition for its own sake, and when you agree with the opposers, it bothers you less, right? And we find ways to justify it, but it's not it's an ineffective way to govern and try to address the problems, and so.
Well, I just wanted to ask, a couple of people have commented that it can be difficult to know what a reputable news source is. And in a lot of what a reputable news source is, the gentleman who was suggesting he wanted good information, but who knows what's good information.
Right.
And so I wondered, in a lot of professional fields, there are accrediting bodies or boards that are self-governing and are passing judgment on members within that community who are not behaving by the standards.
Right.
I don't believe there's such a thing in the media broadly or even in print journalism specifically, but is there any discussion about it? Not that it solves all the problems, because even in those other institutions you can have problems, but it might be a step.
Maybe so. I mean, the model that I liked, and newspapers don't do it much, is the ombudsman model, where you have your own critic or reader representative on the staff that is, and the editor, the publisher don't get a rubber stamp what they put in the paper, and that person is like a journalist asking questions on behalf of the specific readers there in the, but like I said, newspapers with smaller and smaller staffs aren't doing that. There used to be state press associations that sometimes did it, but anyway, and then there's a resistance in the business, and I kind of have that knee-jerk resistance, like, well, who would be the overseers? What would be the standards? And that freedom is. That being said, though, I think an idea could be, but the question would be, who would do it? Where the money would come from? News organizations maybe would do it to improve their credibility, improve their public, so they might have some motivation, but. I got to tell you, man, it's hard to get money to, drive down to Boise to cover, something once. And so, I don't know. I don't think that's a bad idea, but I haven't heard of it being actively pursued. So, I think a lot of the credibility thing, I think some of it you can tell by just looking at the work. Who are they sourcing, right? How do they say they know this? What kind of language are they using around the description of facts? Is it all is one side sort of characterized briefly and the other side given full quotations from 8 people? You can see the ways in which stories are insufficient. And I think over time, but that requires you spending a lot of time doing it as opposed to having some kind of judge and jury. And maybe for me, I have opinions about it because I've been in it for a long time. But good journalism should show you its work. Say, this is why I'm saying this is the number. This is why I'm saying, and if somebody makes like a characteristic or a characterizing comment or an opinion comment, then you quote them saying it. And anyway, I'd like to think it would be apparent, but I realize it's not. Yeah.
Shawn, we're going to wrap up here in a minute, but okay. Is there anything, we started PEG as an organization because of a lot of the things that you talked about. Is there anything that you can see that an organization like PEG could do to help with some of these issues?
Well, I think just the fact that you exist is important. I'm presuming, just based on the folks that I've seen and that I know and that I've heard from, that there's some ideological diversity in this group, and that in and of itself is less common. What struck me was how many people I knew who could not believe Lisa Brown lost by as much as Lisa Brown lost. And I thought, that's a lot of people, and that's a lot of people who don't get outside the city center. I don't get outside the city center all that much, but I have to say, I know a lot of people live in different bubbles, and that's not just on one side. I'm not saying that. It's definitely on both sides. And so trying to cross over and interact more with people that you disagree with in some kind of way, I think, is crucial, just to the social part of it. To being like, well, we're in a family, but we disagree. That's different than being we're at war with each other, right? That's kind of why I wanted to talk about my mom, although I don't think I sort of teased out the best metaphor out of that. But if we can somehow be together in things, in physical places, right? Like this, if we can look at each other as people, it's harder to demonize. I'll tell you as someone who writes opinion that if I have a criticism that I think I might make about a situation, and I talk to the person that might be the object of that criticism, I always change my course in some way. I might not change my mind about the overall issue, but I experience that person as a person. And I don't want to say I don't think that they're a person when I haven't talked to them, but having not spoken to them, my reaction to them, my word choices, the way I might argue my point, the respect I might or might not show that person, it's different if we talk. I try not to be disrespectful just because I haven't talked to somebody, but it's easy not to be disrespectful having talked to somebody. So I think doing the kind of thing you're doing and doing events that try to cross that line maybe is what my idea would be. I don't know. I'm not very good at prescription. So.
Well, thank you, Shawn. We're going to wrap up, Janet.
Okay.
Thank you very much for coming. We appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you all.
upcoming events. On February 27th, Dave really wants me to use the microphone. On February 27th, our next forum will be held at the Moran Prairie County Library. We're having Fair Vote Washington, which is a grassroots Washington nonprofit organization focused on improving electoral processes here in Washington state. Most notably, they're starting with the issue of ranked choice voting. And so their presentation on February 27th for us, our forum, is going to be about ranked choice voting. And they'll talk about their legislative efforts, they'll talk about initiative efforts, and they'll give a general presentation about what they perceive to be the benefits of ranked choice voting. So I would encourage you to check that out. And then while we may have another forum after that in mid-March or April, that's not yet determined, we do have a date set for a May forum on May 6th. Ryan Crocker, who is the former U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan under both the Bush, the second Bush, and the Obama. Come on. All right, I'm nervous. The Obama administrations. So you know he was appreciated by both sides of the aisle on that one, but then also was a former dean of it happens to be the Bush School of Government and Public Policy at the University of Texas A&M. So a guy with some pretty good bona fides, as we said. So that's May 6th. We don't have a location for that yet, but we'll let you know when we do. You can find all this information on our website, pegnow.org. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.